I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Welcome to another Dustbowl Diatribes. This is Season 3, Episode 24. We took a hiatus in September, and so we're back. We took a hiatus to go to a conference. And we have with us our distinguished guest, Chris Cutrone, who's been with us before. Welcome back. He's the leading founder of the Platypus Affiliated Society and the last Marxist, self-proclaimed. And by the way, Chris, I keep forgetting to mention this, but we invented the term Cutrone zone. So we are not ceding that, like, the credit for having invented that term. I think Spencer came up with it.
We're waiting.
Okay, you're not denying it. So we wanted to talk to Chris tonight about his new book, Marxism and Politics, Essays on Critical Theory and the Party, 2006 to 2024, published by Sublation Media. And so I don't know, like, I guess I'll get things started by just giving you my impression of the book, which is that the overall impression to me was that it was quite optimistic. Optimism was the overall impression. And I wanted to just ask you if I'm right about that. And then if you could just kind of characterize your intentions for offering this book.
No, that's an interesting observation, actually, because I feel like The Death of the Millennial Left, which is the sort of first volume in the 2-volume kind of 1,000-page book that it is, might seem pessimistic.
Yeah.
But I think that you're right, that actually there is an optimism, actually to both books, to both selections of writings, namely a kind of optimism about the millennial left, about that moment, and an optimism that these ideas could be understood, at a very basic level, that in fact it was possible to cut through a lot of misunderstanding and reconnect with historical Marxism, that was possible, motivated, people were interested in that, and that this was a real opportunity for it the last, almost 20 years now. So, certainly the work that I did with Platypus as an extracurricular mentor, as a teacher, outside of an academic context, had to be supported by optimism. I wouldn't have been able to do it if I hadn't been optimistic about it.
Yeah, you do a lot of education in this book, just basic education. There are essays in this book that I would just assign to an undergraduate just to learn, what Marxism really means. And was that kind of an intent too, that at least part of this would be kind of an entry point for a lot of people?
Yes. So, I mean, it ranges from the kind of basic fundamental to the more abstruse and esoteric. Hopefully without losing the connecting steps between those. So the essays range, there's a variety of topics, and they're occasional, meaning there were specific occasions for me to write these essays. Again, motivated by what was going on with young people as they were trying to explore this history and these ideas. So, interestingly, I think that it was later that I decided, oh, I really have to get down to brass tacks and explain things at a more elementary level. Because I think that when I started out, I was closer to when I was doing my academic work, working on my dissertation. And so I was in that kind of mode of, high ideas with subtle distinctions. Still, I wasn't writing in an academic context. And so it was a different kind of audience, a different kind of rhetorical register, a different kind of argumentation. But, my general attitude was, okay, you're interested in Marxism? Let's explore that. Right. And I think that over time, it became clear that, oh, actually, some things have to be explained from the beginning. Some early essays did have that quality to them, but again, they were usually in dialogue with the left, with older leftists, where I was trying to engage an established way of talking about things. And then I realized, well, and subtly trying to move it into a different way of talking about it. But then I realized, well, actually, maybe I can just speak more plainly. So some of the essays have that quality.
Well, and the first section of the book is all about Lenin. So could you speak plainly about like who Lenin was and how you would distinguish his brand of Marxism from Stalin and Mao?
Right. So these are the 20th century revolutionaries, we might say. The sort of heroes of communism. The famous sort of sequence of portraits.
Kind of Mount Rushmore like, but
yeah, where it's Marx and Engels, and then it's Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. So Lenin is the controversial figure, and I myself, when I was first introduced to Marxism, didn't start out necessarily predisposed to treating Lenin sympathetically. I think that I was suspicious of the Soviet Union and of that whole experience. I didn't feel the need to closely identify with the Russian Revolution. I didn't like the Second Cold War, kind of Ronald Reagan, 1980s, anti-communism, anti-Sovietism. But that didn't make me counter-identify, and then, grant me sympathy to the other side, so to speak. Not necessarily. I think I write about this a bit in the foreword, where probably at a more kind of cultural literary level, like George Orwell's Animal Farm, I had a kind of, or even there are aspects of 1984, I had a kind of more sympathy for Trotsky as a kind of romantic figure rather than Lenin. Trotsky is like a tragic figure as opposed to Lenin as the successful figure. So nonetheless, the millennial left did try to reapproach Lenin. Like there was a kind of Lenin moment for the millennial left, a kind of reconsideration. And so that's where my earlier education as a Marxist came into play, One of my first undergraduate course papers was about Lenin. It's about Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg's criticisms of Lenin. And I took a relatively deep dive for a second year undergraduate student into their writings and, gained a new appreciation of Lenin. And that has always stuck with me against ostensible Leninism, right? So when we're talking about like Lenin and Stalin and Mao, they're all ostensible Leninists. I mean, Lenin is himself, but Stalin and Mao are ostensible Leninists. And I saw pretty early on the case for distinguishing Lenin from Leninism. And that he had been kind of tailored by subsequent communists to fit and justify what they were doing, which was actually quite different from his own perspective and what he did. So, it's something that I've, studied for a long time, know a lot about Lenin and that history, but, it wasn't clear to me that it was particularly relevant to people until the millennials themselves decided that they wanted to re-examine that history. So the difference is, and I think that ironically enough, when I was writing these essays, I didn't have the present moment in mind, but right now, there is a kind of neo-Stalinism afoot with the Zoomers and with some of the millennials, but the Zoomers really, the younger people. And they distinguish between like the revolution and socialist construction. So they tend to look at Stalin and Mao as figures of successful socialist construction, like not just making the revolution, but building socialism, which is a particular way of looking at things, right? It's a specific way of looking at things. I think that everything that I know about history and about Marxism would cause me to not think about things in that way. I don't think that, especially because the Soviet Union and communist China today don't claim to be socialist. Right. So that's another important point. So it's kind of like, okay, socialist construction, but they haven't gotten there yet. They didn't claim that for themselves. And so even just at that level, I always realized, well, the more important question is the revolution rather than the socialist construction. And maybe the revolution did produce like Stalinism and, these things, authoritarian, totalitarian regimes. Maybe that was the necessary outcome of these revolutions. But again, for me, it seems like this history recurs. It seems like people are drawn back to these figures, not in the sense of history repeating itself, but in the sense of people recall it. It seems meaningful. It has some kind of symbolism. Even if to my mind it can be superficial, it speaks in some way. And so I'm interested in what that might be, right? Is there an itch that people are trying to scratch around like Marxism itself, but really like revolutionary politics? And, I was just recently, I'm doing a course for Theory Underground on the introduction to Marxism. And we just did Lenin last week, Lenin, State and Revolution. And I said, I think we wouldn't be talking about Marxism if it hadn't been for Lenin. If it hadn't been for the Russian Revolution, I don't think we'd be talking about Marxism at all. I think Marx and Marxism would be a kind of antiquated 19th century curiosity. I don't think we would be talking about Marxism. I think after World War I, after the collapse of the Second International in World War I, and really the devastation of the mass socialist movement that called itself Marxist up to that point, without the Russian Revolution, I don't think there would be a discussion of Marxism.
Isn't there a danger of going back to these figures as somehow definitive, though? I'm thinking of Nietzsche's warning of monumental and antiquarian history, right? And just
Oh yeah.
that sort of, our Americans going back to the founders and thinking that that's somehow definitive is another example
Hmm.
of that. Like, is is the good of their appeal enough to
Enough.
outweigh? Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, look, I defend the founding fathers too. I defend the American revolutionaries. That's how I'd like to refer to them as well. So in terms of Nietzsche and history, yeah, the three kinds of history, right? So the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical. So can we have a critical history regarding Marxism? Meaning, can we make kind of ruthless judgments about how we might need this history in a way that's different from either monumentalizing it, just sort of turning it into a canonical tradition, or getting antiquarian about it and sort of dissolving it into its sort of details, in a kind of historicist way. Where it remains sort of endlessly fascinating and ambiguous, but really kind of sequestered off in a past time, right? So can we actually have a renewed kind of living relationship to this history? For me, that's an open question, meaning I treat that, again, in a very Nietzschean way as a task. It's not a given, right? So critical history has this kind of tasking character to it. So again, working with younger people who, I taught Marxism academically. I was comfortable doing that. I had done that at the University of Chicago. I did it at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It was authorized for me to do that. In the social sciences core, it was standard curriculum. It was considered part of the canon. And, the students wanted to know more than I was giving them academically, meaning I was happy to teach Marxism in a very kind of strong way, but basically neutrally, meaning here are some ideas for you to consider. And again, for me, it's kind of like, well, if it doesn't mean anything to younger people, then it really doesn't mean anything, right? And so, so then I'm interested in what it means to them, why they're interested, and then do I have anything to say about that? Right? But I myself would not have jumped into the public sphere as someone promulgating Marxism without the millennial left motivating that, right? It's a particular role that I took on. I think as an academic, I would have been interested in Marxism, but again, more neutrally, as like a fact of intellectual history, the Frankfurt School. In other words, here are some ideas to consider. They may or may not be relevant. That's different. That has a different kind of quality to it, and a different intellectual discipline to it as well, right? Which is not to say that I've just been promulgating Marxism politically, right? But trying to uphold with some integrity the ideas, right? And also, the kind of historical figures, right? So there are ideas, and then there are these figures like Lenin, who's an actor, not just an idea or a set of ideas, right? So it's tricky. I mean, it's tricky to navigate, and I knew it was tricky from the beginning. And so I hope I've been adequately careful about it. But again, in maybe a different way than the way academics are supposed to be careful.
Well, and it seems to me like looking from the outside, there's two aspects of what you've been doing. You've been making the kind of let's reconsider Marxism and Leninism to the left. But then also what you're saying is actually Marx and Lenin, there's a direct continuity from them to the American revolutionaries, which for Americans is a very counterintuitive claim. And then further, actually, to have the revolution that Lenin would want us to have in 2025 or 2040, whenever, it primarily, winning over the intellectuals and the cognoscenti is part of it. But a bigger part is like converting normies and bars.
Sure.
And
Now,
bars
again, yeah, like trying to convert people to Marxism, that's a dicey proposition. I had an experience on the sectarian Marxist left with a kind of notorious group, the Spartacist League, who were not really rabble-rousers. They were people who more polemicized against other leftists. So they didn't really do much demagogy. So I think, another aspect that I think is important for my approach is a kind of via negativa approach, a kind of, influenced by Adorno. And understanding where Adorno got that from, that it's not like a negative theology, it's rather, or some kind of tragic Judaism or something. That the via negativa is actually core to the Marxism, meaning to really address what Marxism isn't and what Lenin, for example, wasn't, right? Which, I kind of learned it this way, but also taught it this way, especially teaching the Frankfurt School, critical theory, that, Marx is a critic of socialism and communism. And a figure like Lenin is critical of Marxism. But also like Rosa Luxemburg. Again, Rosa Luxemburg is a kind of romanticized figure. She's a martyr to the cause. And so she's certainly seen as a critic of Marxism in her time. And then Trotsky is seen as a critic as well, but in a different way because he's a critic of Stalinism. However, he was also, like Lenin and Luxemburg, a critic of Marxism before the revolution. Right? So they're participants in a mass movement that they are critical of. Critical not in the sense of a kind of simple negativity, but in the sense of a crisis. Meaning, Laura, you and I have this in common. Political science, political theory, right? That kind of study of politics. I feel like it's like a lost art, a lost discipline. But that's where I was trained as an undergraduate. And, my kind of early mentor, Adolf Reed, political scientist. And, it's, I feel like thinking about politics in a critical way, Marxism is, its history, the history of Marxism, is a very interesting case, to say the least, of politics. And what do we even mean by politics, right? Rosa Luxemburg's biographer, J.P. Nettle, was a kind of liberal political historian and political scientist. And, he just forthrightly said, look, anyone trying to think about politics in the modern world has to address Marxism, because within Marxism, all the questions are raised about what do we even mean by politics? What do we mean by political and social change? What do we mean about historical transformation that takes place in and through politics? That Marxism is the, ultimate case to consider. Right now, meaning if we want a meaningful politics and political future, whether or not it's going to be Marxist, Marxism is nonetheless an important historical lesson to learn.
And I guess to me, the elephant in the room is if there's any either religious person listening to this or even liberals like of the J.P. Nettle variety, or whether they imagine themselves to be conservatives or progressives, like what would you say are their misapprehensions of what Lenin actually believed? And then if they could get over those to really engage with him as a thinker, what would Lenin have to say to them?
Right. So the first would be, maybe Marxism isn't based on a fundamentally different set of principles politically than other forms of politics that take place in the modern era, in the capitalist era. That they share a circumstance, share a condition, and that it's not a matter of different principles. So it's not like, oh, well, the capitalists have their political principle, but then Marxism says the working class has an entirely different political principle. Well, no, right? So trying to look at a social historical understanding of, liberal democracy, so-called liberal democracy, or modern democratic republicanism, that, it's not just an idea. It seems to be something that organically developed and has a power and a kind of persistence through the last 200 years. The results of the American and French revolutions, the aspiration remains consistent up to today. When there's a political crisis, when there's a revolution, what are people looking for? What are they reaching for? What are they trying to accomplish? And that Marxism isn't trying to do something wholly different. Right? It exists in that world. It exists within that history and within that historical aspiration. And then understands it as, specific to the crisis of the modern era, right? So rather than just thinking about it as like a kind of abstract principle that might be like good in and of itself, it's like, okay, everybody basically wants liberal democracy, more or less. Even, so the Frankfurt School, they're interesting in this respect. So their understanding of like Nazism is that it's a distressed liberalism. Right, but that they just put the nation state in the place of, or the racial community in the place of the individual. Right, they're sort of claiming the rights of like the nation or the race, where liberals would claim it on behalf of the individual. But that ultimately it has the same shape, has the same form. And so even when people don't realize that they are doing this, nonetheless they are. And that, again, the way Marx understood the struggle for socialism was not like a different species of politics, but it was in and through that same general political aspiration. But then the question is, why does it fail? Why does liberal democracy consistently fail in the last 200 years? So that contradiction, right? Why is it that this is what people spontaneously aspire towards, and yet ultimately it fails? And how does that impact our understanding of capitalism? Not just as an economic system, but as a societal crisis and as a political condition, right? So not just looking at capitalism socioeconomically, but politically, which I think most Marxists don't do, are not really comfortable with doing. And, in the political science realm, one will hear often, oh, Marxism doesn't have a political theory, doesn't have a theory of politics, doesn't have a theory of the state. And that's true insofar as it doesn't have a different theory than the one already generated by liberal and democratic thinkers who are contemporary with it.
So, oh, sorry.
So what exactly? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, like, to clarify, why liberal democracy is seen as failing, like for our listeners, how, explain that a bit.
Yeah, a few weeks before our coming election, right? Where we're going to have some rehearsal of the failure. I was just watching a Fox News interview with Kamala Harris, in which Bret Baier asked her, why is it that almost 80% of Americans say that the country's on the wrong track? And she said, well, because Donald Trump has been on the political stage for the last 10 years. Right? And then it's like, okay, well, even if we were to blame Trump, where did Trump come from? Right? And then Bret Baier, of course, the Fox News journalist, he just said, yeah, but half the electorate supports Trump. And so how do you explain that? Meaning if you're going to blame Trump for the country being on the wrong track, nonetheless, he still has half the support. Right? And, I only digress to say, there's liberal democracy, there's discontent with liberal democracy. And not recent, but long-standing. Meaning certainly there are more acute moments. And I do think the last 20 years has been an acute moment of a crisis of American democracy. I think the millennial left was a product of that. I think the millennial left was a product of the crisis of American democracy, manifest in like the war on terror and the Great Recession. It's clear that Obama was meant to solve some things that he did not, and that it's just been this rolling crisis. And so again, what are the reasons for that? And I do think that Marxism has been reached to for an explanation. Whether it's a kind of like world systems theory, like geopolitical explanation, or whether it's a kind of, socioeconomic or kind of decline of capitalism theory, Marxism has had an important role in explaining to young people what's going wrong. Now, I'm not happy with those explanations that people chalk up to Marxism, but nonetheless, that's been the case. And of course, the parallel phenomenon to Trump is Bernie Sanders. And clearly his supporters among young people were looking for a solution to the crisis of American democracy and for a restoration of liberal democracy. They called it socialism. That's fine, right? But what they really wanted was a restoration of liberal democracy. They wanted a more functional liberal democratic political order. So, I mean, I don't know, if we have to explain it exactly. The Citizens United decision, the question of money in politics. I think this election is going to be the most expensive, right? I think Kamala raised $1 billion. These elections have gotten extremely expensive. I'm not sure that there's much to show for all that money that's spent, right? I don't think that it tends to move things very much. Trump famously spends a lot less than the Democrats do in the last 3 elections, right? He gets more bang for his buck in that respect, right? But nonetheless, the Democrats, and their corporate donors and also their small donors feel like, okay, we'll just throw more money at it. That will solve it, right? So ironically, it's like, okay, there was a desire to get the money out of politics, the corrupting influence of money, but generally it's been met with just more money. I think Obama and also Bernie and also Trump to a certain degree have really benefited from small donors funding. So it's, that explanation doesn't seem to be pertinent anymore. You don't hear people complaining about money in politics. I remember it wasn't that long ago when people were saying the election should be publicly funded and limited. Nobody says that anymore, right? So clearly that explanation ended up being implausible. And so then, well, okay, so what is it? Is it culture? Is it cultural divisions, right? So people are scrambling. I think that we're also in a moment now. I do think that the millennial left died. I do think we're in a moment of kind of exhaustion. I do think that people have stopped trying to explain things, actually. I think they did try in a more acute way, and then they stopped. And they kind of fell back on some, platitudes.
So what is Lennon's explanation of the core sickness that ails all of this?
Right. So, I dare say Lennon's explanation is not different from Marx's. So it goes back to, just a couple of weeks ago, so I mentioned I was teaching Lennon's State and Revolution. Before that, it was Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte on the results of 1848. And so, the idea that the capitalist state is itself a phenomenon of this historical crisis, and that it's taken on this form starting then in an increasing way. Something popped up on my YouTube feed today. I didn't click on it. It was something like positive theory of bureaucratization or something like that, right? And I thought, oh, we're going to do that now. We're going to do like the theory of bureaucracy. right? Which was an earlier 20th century kind of concern. And I just thought, okay, we're going to recycle all this stuff in terms of explanations that people have tried to give, because that was an alternative, kind of Max Weber alternative to Marxism. It was raised as an alternative explanation to Marxism about the inherent tendency towards bureaucratization. Whereas Lenin and Marx thought, well, this bureaucratization is actually a phenomenon of the crisis of capitalism, meaning that politics is losing its kind of social base and becomes more freewheeling, and the state rises above society. So even the conventional Marxist understanding, I would say inaccurate to Marx and someone like Lenin, is the idea that, well, it's a capitalist state in the sense that it belongs to the capitalist class socioeconomically, rather than the state is doing everything it possibly can try to do to hold capitalism together in a way that the social action, the kind of civil social power and the economic power of the capitalist class itself cannot do. Right? So what used to be a function of power in civil society ends up being taken up by the state. Right? That the state has to come in and rescue this society from itself in capitalism. So, and with predictably bad results, meaning it sort of tries various things, it fails, it kicks the can down the road, to use an expression from not that long ago, right, in the Great Recession, kicks the can down the road, but not just at the level of economic policy, but at the level of politics. How do you get the consent of the governed? How do you craft a new consensus? Right? It's very elusive in times like this. And I think also when we look back at the history, we misremember things. We look back on, like, I don't know, FDR as like uniting the country. No, he's very divisive. There was a lot of contention in that era, right? So I think that the Marxist explanation that Lenin would have, drawing on Marx, would be to see the state as a phenomenon of crisis, and to see the politics around the state as really manifesting that crisis. The inability of the ruling class to actually achieve a consensus, and therefore it falling to political figures to try to force solutions that don't work, and yet do still preserve the power of the state. I don't know if that's too convoluted, but, in other words, why aren't we just having class struggle, workers and capitalists in society? Why is it always a political crisis of the state? Right. Again, it's a deep question. The fact that the Russian Revolution is there with Lenin, it's easy to say, oh, well, this was an old kind of feudalistic absolutist regime. It was Tsarism. So, of course, there was a crisis of that state in the modern world. But what about the fact that very modern states experience these crises as well? Right? That's the deeper question. It's sort of easy to say, oh, well, the Tsar fell under the impact of modernity. But what's going on in the United States now? How do we explain that?
Well, and I feel like the two most common explanations Americans will give you is, if they're of a more like religious persuasion, they'll just say this is tragic fallen human nature, and no tree will grow to heaven, and that's enough. And then
Tower of Babel will fall.
Right. Or yeah, we're all very fragile, finite beings, and that's enough to explain it for some people. And then people that accept a more like liberal, imminent bourgeois worldview, well, you can say if the liberals would just quit terrorizing us and vote for Trump, or vice versa, if we would all just be grown-ups and go with the obvious grown-up party, of which we have only one of the two, then it would be fine. And I think in all these frameworks, like it seems to me that Marxism, it's viewed, I'm not saying it's consciously viewed this way, but it's like a kind of structural anti-Semitism. Like there's this subversive idea coming out from from the outside that doesn't really have anything to do other than parasitize our sane, stable society. So I don't know, that's a little spiel. Do you kind of agree with that articulation as where
the way it's
people
usually
are?
seen.
Yeah.
It's usually seen. Yeah, it's seen as an external rather than internal problem, right? If there wasn't this kind of venality and corruption, there are varieties of that. And, I mean, again, this is one of the reasons why I defend the American Revolution and the American revolutionaries, in part because I think it's a cheap out to just say, oh, well, they didn't really mean it, or they were hypocrites, or they only meant it for, rich, straight, white men. That's easy, right? Like, if that explanation is easy, the more difficult problem to face is, what if they really meant it? What if they really meant all are equal with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? What if they really meant it? Then what? Right? And then why did it go wrong? Right? And again, is it human nature? I mean, certainly that's been the explanation in my lifetime. It's human nature. There's a variety of different versions of that. Whether that's understood spiritually or like sociobiologically. Oh yeah, right? And so, I mean, I guess the religious view would be that we took a wrong turn when we secularized because we gave into human nature. Whereas when it was more theocratic, we recognized the need for religion to keep a check on human nature. Right. Obviously, it's a more complicated story than that. I was just today, for some reason, thinking about Augustine, city of God, city of man. And obviously, it's far more of an interesting problem posed in that tradition than this kind of view that I just articulated. But what I just articulated, I think, is more the common sense view. All right, people have lost touch with values, lost touch with God, right? Lost touch with the better side of our nature and have given into the worse side of our nature. Right? I think that is a kind of commonsensical view, but then the question is what to do about it. Right? I mean, again, with Lenin, what is to be done about it? Which, by the way, Lenin's title is from a novel, and the novel is a interesting kind of tragedy about bohemian radicals and revolutionaries. So there's a kind of irony to that. What is to be done? Right? It's not as straightforward as that, right? So, I think that that's tricky. I'm not sure that we really, I mean, the Democrats will say and the left will say that there's a theocratic politics afoot in the United States in the last generation. I don't think that that's really true. I don't think that that's actually true. I don't think that's accurate to the Christian right. I don't think that they are quite aspiring to be theocratic in that way. It's not, I don't think it's as straightforward or as literal as that. And it's more been about, using the political arena to make a religious appeal to people culturally, right? It's been taking up the political arena as a cultural arena, which is different from saying, okay, we just want the political arena to be subject to the cultural arena.
Right.
Right. And I think that's what a lot of people on the left and the Democrats lose sight of, is that actually the Christians have a different conception of this. Right. It's not, whereas the left and the Democrats might want to impose a cultural value system, a secular cultural value system politically, right? Because they wouldn't observe that difference.
So could I ask you, so I've been reading this book, and yes, I'm about 8 years too late, right? Came out, I think, in 2016, but Todd McGowan's Capitalism and Desire, he's got a more recent book published with Sublation. And I'm not all the way through it, but I definitely got the message that, human nature is characterized more by a sense of lack and is driven by a sense of lack because we're linguistic creatures. So we use signifiers for objects. And so we automatically, there's a difference. I don't want to get into the details, but there's a difference between like the object and our signifier. And then this produces a sense that, our reality is one of lack or difference. And he seems to be arguing that capitalism, it wasn't an absolute necessity, but it feeds into this need that we actually aren't looking for fulfillment, absolute fulfillment, because we can't have that, but we're looking for what we can obtain in the future. We can imagine fulfillment, but we also can feel the lack, which is what actually makes us feel, I think, alive. And I'm wondering, like as I read your book, I couldn't help but feel like your position is socialism would fulfill us somehow. What could you kind of address, like the difference, if there is a difference between that viewpoint and your own?
There is a difference. So Todd McGowan, who I've had some dialogue with, is a Lacanian. And so, does think that this speaks to a kind of ontological condition, it's not merely psychological. It has something to do with the nature of being itself, actually, this lack and this desire. So I wouldn't look at it that way. I'd look at it as something far more specific and make less grand ontological claims about humanity, the human condition. Because I think that sells short the idea that there might be another problem, meaning that maybe this problem wasn't always with us, because of course, based on what we were just talking about, it would seem to suggest that religion also did that, right? Was motivated by that desire due to lack. And you raised like language, so kind of anthropological understanding of humanity that's really basic, to our condition. I'm not so sure, right, that we can chalk it up to that. And I'll just throw a little dig in there. Can I do that? The French fries, Lacan. Isn't it all about Catholicism? Isn't it a specific theology? Isn't it like a very Catholic theology that we're dealing with? Like, I kind of feel that way. I feel like, Althusser, Lacan, I feel like, or even, I get into arguments with my publisher, Doug Lane, about this, about Guy Debord, that when I'm reading about the spectacle, it feels like, am I reading about the church? Seems like it, And so, it's like a kind of a Protestant, it's a very bourgeois discontent with the church. I feel like the French are still struggling with the church. And yeah, I mean, I'm Italian American. I'm also Irish American. And I don't know, but I'm younger and, growing up in America, I don't feel like I'm struggling with this. I'm struggling with the image that's an image of lack, and that's motivated by desire and a kind of longing, and a kind of, communion with the divine through an inadequate symbol, right? Jouissance. I just feel like, isn't this just Catholicism? Like, really? But anyway, that's my dig. Sorry, I took a little bit too long.
That's okay. I think that was a very interesting little excursion because as I'm reading it, I can't help but think this has like religious overtones. It has psychological as well as religion, obviously. But yes, like it, I'm writing notes on the side margins. Oh, this could be this. There's direct parallels there. So yes,
You see what I mean, right?
Yeah, I do
So
see what you mean.
that's my dig.
Okay.
But more substantially, right? Getting back to my point about, I think, as a Marxist, if I just inhabit my Marxism, which I don't take my Marxism for granted, I should mention that, but inhabiting my Marxism, then that would lead me to think that everyone actually is talking about the same thing, but in different ways. And so then the question is, what are those different ways? And one approach that I have to discriminating among the different ways people have of talking about what is essentially capitalism, whether they call it that or not, or recognize it as such, is how acute the problem is defined. And part of that is the historical specificity of it. Like, can we narrow this down to something that's only 200 years old rather than thousands of years old? Right? So, because I do feel the need to be agnostic about whether people in the Middle Ages were struggling with the same thing we're struggling with. And what that means, getting to your question about socialism fulfilling, it's not a fulfillment. It's not a fulfillment. It's a task, meaning let's get past this problem of capitalism. There will be other problems beyond capitalism. Let's get to those. That's my understanding of freedom. My understanding of freedom is that we have generated a specific form of unfreedom that we're tasked with overcoming, and there will be another freedom problem after that. So it's not about, paradise on earth. I think that we might, in some ways, necessarily imagine it that way. And insofar as Marxism did have a utopic aspiration to overcome thousands of years of class society, okay, maybe it is that. Maybe it is that. But of course, the Paleolithic peoples were not living in paradise, right? That was not the Garden of Eden, right? The noble savage is not the Garden of Eden. So, primitive communism. So even then, it's really more like, okay, there's the human existential condition. We don't know what it is in its fundamentals, stripped of social reality. But we do know history as a history of specific societal manifestations of this problem. And so my sense of Marxism is that it's about getting past this specific problem of the last 200 years, capitalism. And then we'll see what comes. Right? It's not about, it's the end of history in a particular way. Marx and Engels talk about the end of prehistory and the beginning of true history. So that's an interesting way of putting it, because it doesn't mean the end of history. It means the beginning of true history, meaning now the true struggle for freedom begins. Meaning, what are we actually going to do with our freedom? In a new way.
Because freed from necessity.
Well, from a specific kind of necessity. Like I said, there are different ways of thinking about it. I think Murray Bookchin has the idea of like post-scarcity socialism, right? So maybe what characterizes the history of civilization, the history of class society, is a history of scarcity. And that capitalism is this pathological condition in which we have overcome scarcity in a certain way, or at least potentially have overcome scarcity, but have a new kind of scarcity that we've imposed on ourselves, unbeknownst, right, to ourselves, without intending to do so. So that's another way of characterizing things. But I would sort of hesitate on that because I'm not sure, again, like thinking about Murray Bookchin, like a qualitative transformation in human need, right? So overcoming scarcity sounds like quantitative, like, do we finally have enough? And I think it's a more qualitative transformation that we're aspiring towards. And that's in the air, by the way. Like in my lifetime, post-humanist futures, like this kind of stuff, even postmodernism they were really reaching for a qualitative sense of transformation. And they kind of, I think, mistakenly consigned the old Marxism to a kind of linear progressive, more quantitative view of we're going to unleash the industrial forces of production so that we finally have enough, so we overcome scarcity. When I read Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky, they talk about other things. They do talk about a qualitative transformation. And Marx and Engels talk about a qualitatively changed relation to nature. They don't just talk about, okay, let's just let industrial production loose and give everyone enough. It's much more about a redefinition of what we mean by need and by want, by desire, to get back to McGowan, right? But desire in a more practical sense rather than an ontological sense, like an unfulfillable desire, but rather, why do we desire what we want? And how do we generate new desires in history?
Well, and another thing you talk about in the book is that you say Lenin had a conception of history that was cyclical instead of, a sort of more Whiggish linear theory. Can you expand upon that and tie that into what you just said?
Yes, that's very important. So, again, influenced by the Frankfurt School, what I found was in Marxism itself, whether in Marx and Engels or Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin and Trotsky, a view of modern history as regressive, right? So not merely progressive, but also regressive. And really, it's the contradiction of those two things and the dynamics underlying that contradiction, so that maybe to use a Freudianism, repetition is regression. Or we could say regression involves repetition. And so that's a different view of how history moves. Again, not in an ontological sense, but maybe in the sense of this is the way history moves in capitalism, specifically. That it's a combination of the linear and the cyclical, but in a different way than for the ancients. The ancients also had both linear and cyclical conceptions of historical time and of the relation between those things. But in a, speaking less generally, that the modern world, there's a specific way in which these things are combined and also contradictory. So regression, I think, is a very important core idea for me from Benjamin and Adorno, but where they got it from. They got it from Rosa Luxemburg and from Marx, but also from Engels and Lenin and Trotsky and other Marxists. So it was recapturing that. Now, I would say about Whiggish history. So Stalinism has the quality of Whiggish history. That's important to note. Stalinist progressivism is this Whiggish history, and in that sense is a kind of recrudescence of a kind of bourgeois progressivism. And it is also modeled. I mean, Benjamin talks about this on the concept of history, or the theses on the philosophy of history, that technical progress is social progress. Whereas the point is to recognize the contradiction between technical progress and social progress in capitalism. I think the way Benjamin puts it is progress in technology and neglecting retrogression of society. And again, that's a common issue of both the capitalist West and the communist East in the 20th century. Both sides of the Cold War experienced the same thing. So-called technical progress or technological progress while also experiencing societal retrogression or regression. Right? So, I think that there are some rich ideas here in the history of Marxism that are easily overlooked, easily neglected, but I still think are vital as ways of characterizing the modern world and the problems we still face. It's counterintuitive though. I think that like the conservative progressive antinomy that we have doesn't really abide. I think that what happens is when people think about regression, they do reach for a more religious framework for thinking about things. And of course, I'd be remiss to neglect to mention that people, unfortunately, reinterpret Benjamin and Adorno as theological, as religious thinkers on this basis, not realizing, well, no, actually, there's something about recent secular history that has this character. So it's not about the fall of man. But it is a reinterpretation of the fall of man as characterizing something specific in capitalism. Why capitalism would be millenarian? Because it has been.
Mm-hmm. I have I think one of the more fun things in the book that I encountered was that you like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump more than you like Bernie Sanders.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to ask you about that because I know that Bernie didn't get anywhere, did frustrate a lot of people. That's a source of a lot of disappointment. So people had put a lot of hope in Bernie Sanders. So why are you so down on Bernie Sanders, and why would you say, either Hillary or Donald Trump are better than Bernie Sanders?
Oh, they're more political. I mean, unfortunately, I know of Bernie going way back to when I was in college, because I was in college at Hampshire College in Western Massachusetts, and Bernie was the socialist just up the road in Vermont. He was the butt of our jokes. You could be a socialist like Bernie Sanders. Right? And what did that mean? It meant kind of virtuous guy, heart in the right place. Just sort of Jeremiads against the system. But that's about it. Right? And that was his role in Congress, in the Senate. He gave speeches that nobody listened to. Like the chamber emptied, and he just spoke to the C-SPAN camera and denounced X, Y, and Z. And he was a message candidate in 2016 and in 2020. I think he knew he couldn't become the nominee and therefore couldn't become president. Now, let me be careful. He, of course, could be president of the United States. Absolutely. No problem. He's a capitalist politician. He'd probably be a very competent president of the United States, actually. But that wasn't his aspiration. He didn't want power like that. So we have to admire the ruthlessness of Hillary and the Donald. Right? I refer to them in Comrade Clinton, Comrade Trump. Right? Comrade Clinton, Comrade Trump would be, in an alternate timeline, could have been important revolutionary figures in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Why not? Right? So, I'm not sure that Bernie is political like that. Right? And so it's that kind of simple thing. And again, it's because, look, politics is a sore spot. Are we comfortable with political power? Are we comfortable with the struggle for power? Maybe not, right? There aren't great examples of it. And yet, I think that for things to change, you have to have the taste for power. You have to have the taste for the struggle for power. You have to want power. It's got to be about power. So, again, like dealing with young people, politics, look, in our lifetime, it's become a spectator sport, hasn't it? Well, except it isn't. Like there are real stakes, real consequences. Decisions are made, things happen as a result. So, it's one thing to just sort of, okay, what's your favorite movie? What kind of music do you like? Who are you going to vote for? No, it's about power. And so, I'm talking to the few people who might be interested in that.
Right. Could a president actually make the kind of change that you're hoping for? I mean, sort of buried in your, entertainment of Trump is this notion that if we could elect, maybe he's not the one because he just doesn't have much of a clue. I mean, but if we could elect a person, right, who could, I mean, sorry, if I may differ, but it just doesn't seem like he has much of a clue. But if we could elect the right person, could that person have enough oomph and enough power to be able to actually make a change?
So just to refer to recent history, Obama said this, and Bernie and Trump have said this, but Obama said, he needed to be supported by a movement. That he couldn't get done any of the things that he promised. And actually he promised a lot less than people thought he promised without a movement, right? Now, Bernie also claimed to be leading a movement, and Trump, of course, says that he's leading the greatest movement in American history, the greatest political movement, because everything with Trump is the greatest and the most beautiful. And he's more beautiful than Kamala Harris, which might be true in some way. I mean, she's not bad, but he might just be in a different league of his own. Well, but can a president, so the reason I raised all of that is no, of course, right? So from my perspective, they can do some things, but of course, a president in and of themselves can't, right? So, when you think about like pivotal transformative figures in American political history, Lincoln, FDR, even Reagan to a certain extent. It wasn't just them. They had to have congressional support, and they had to meet a real social need, a real societal desire for change, and actual impulse to change on the ground. Right now, again, it's what we were talking about earlier. A lot of social change happens just within the capitalist sphere itself. It happens due to decisions made in civil society. Of course, corporations have a great deal of power, but they, of course, can only do what they do within a certain context, according to the existing social conditions. So even though the working class is kind of this mute, passive thing, actually it does, whether intentionally or not, create the conditions in which capitalist change can or cannot happen. So, no, I don't think that a president can even make substantial changes within capitalism. Not alone. Certainly not alone. But again, how do people become president? So these kind of historical hinge figures tend to come along when there's a mood for change, when there's some impulse to change. And then, of course, the difference between the ostensible program and the rhetoric and actually what happens on the ground, that's a significant difference as well. But you can still mark certain changes by reference to some elected high office people. You can. I mean, I think so that's one, at the level of like in principle, hypothetically. In practice, we are living in a time of extreme political dysfunction. And not just because of partisan gridlock, the parties themselves, I think, this is something that I've written about, are in disarray. And the fact that Bernie did so well in the primaries, and the fact that Trump became the nominee and the president of the Republican Party. You know, if the parties had their act together, neither of those things could have happened. So, you know, it's an interesting time in that respect, meaning some kind of normal functioning of American politics has broken down. That's just a fact. Now, whether that's good or bad, it's probably bad on net, but it's the reality we have to deal with. And so for me, you know, just to be clear on the Trump point, I at a certain moment I said, this has to become a teachable moment. I have to make this a teachable moment. This has to be a learning opportunity. And that is so tricky to do. You know, he's a whack job. I mean, you know, like he just, you know what I mean? It's like, what do you know this term, sane washing? Sane washing Trump. Have you heard about this? So this is the new kind of media discourse. Don't sane
Yeah.
wash Trump. And it's like, yeah, I've been doing that for like the last 8 years. I've been sane washing Trump, you know, like trying to get to the rational kernel of Trumpism, which is different from like what they mean. What they mean is Trump's suffering dementia, and so people are desperately trying to make it make sense. And that's not true. No. He might be,
No.
right? But anyway, sane washing Trump, rational kernel of Trump and Trumpism, but of Trump in particular, because I think a lot of Trumpism is actually not Trump. Like, I'm not sure, like, the Vivek Ramaswamys and J.D. Vances and people like that, or Steve Bannon, what they want Trump to be is actually not what Trump is, and not what he wants to be. And I think that Trump's the more interesting phenomenon, rather than these kind of ideologues with their fantasies. That's just me. Like, in other words, I'm actually interested in empirical, concrete political reality more than these kind of ideologies that you can never separate from like marketing or something, you know.
Well, and where he is an interesting figure, I guess, as some sort of Bonapartist character, is their charisma, is their ability to somehow or other gain acceptance from all these different coalitions and ideologies and functionally con them while doing the bare minimum to like keep the system running.
And he's not been that great at that, has he? In other words, like often Bonapartist figures are unifying figures at the end of the day. I think that he's tried to be, but it hasn't quite worked out. And that's, I'm sure, his own failing. It's not only because he's been sabotaged by the Republicans and the Democrats out of their own very narrow political self-interest, in the sense of like thinking just about their political careers and the way they prefer to conduct public rhetoric. Like there's just been a stunning amount of lack of imagination. You know, so you see some people in the Republican Party trying to get with the Trump agenda. So like Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio trying to be Trumpist, and it's cute, it's amusing, and I think they're sincere about it. You know, like, oh, what if we actually had to appeal to the working class? What would that look like? You know, so they're putting in something of an honest effort. But I think generally Trump's been resisted because it's gotten really ossified. It's gotten really decadent, the two parties. And they're very resistant to change, remarkably, because just at the level of like rhetoric and messaging, they seem unwilling to change or think outside the box. It's really strange. I don't know. I mean, that's what strikes me. And maybe that sounds very superficial, but I feel like that's a factor in it. And I guess my sense of Trump was that, I mean, again, Marx on Louis Bonaparte, the paradigmatic example, but even like a kind of Otto von Bismarck, you know, that a kind of all things to all people, a kind of empty signifier, that aspect of Bonapartism, Trump has not been able to do that. He's been too particular. He's been too peculiar of a figure, too idiosyncratic to quite do that, to be the empty signifier. That would be maybe the normal functioning of American presidents, is that they can be like empty signifiers that can unite. So again, Bonapartism as a background condition, not just an acute kind of crisis. So a little bit of a different way of talking about it than the way liberals would talk about Bonapartism. They would talk about a Bonapartist figure as being like a crisis figure. Marxists talk about it in two different senses. One would be as a crisis figure, the other would be as like a general condition of the capitalist state, that it has to try to appeal to everyone but satisfy no one. Right, which is a little bit different from when Trump says that it's a good deal when nobody is quite happy. Right, that's a little different. So it's really about the state taking the initiative and the state inserting itself as an indispensable part of things. And again, that's long since happened, but that was new in the 19th century. It was new in Marx's time and relatively new in American life. I think only late 19th, early 20th century was that the case. But now is a very old thing that we take for granted. So, yeah, I mean, the Bonapartism question, I think I have a general view of that in terms of understanding capitalist politics that is actually different from the way I understand Trump as a figure of this moment. If that makes sense.
I think so. Just to be clear, what exactly, how is he not a Bonapartist figure?
Well, because he hasn't achieved a new consensus. He represents the need for a new bipartisan consensus, a new post-neoliberal way of conducting things, both at the level of policy and at the level of rhetoric and ideological vision. But he is not that. And, I don't think that he's had a great ambition in that respect. He's been more deliberately retrograde, like let's bring back the 90s, but without the mistakes that were made, like NAFTA and bringing China into the WTO or something like that. So, his ambitions have been rather limited, rather modest, right? And so that's also important to pay attention to. And so I think that he is a phenomenon like Bernie, because Bernie's also a blast from the past. I mean, this is the thing. When Trump and Bernie emerged in 2015, I was like, what the hell's going on here? These are people from the 80s. What is this? I mean, yes, Trump was like The Apprentice. He was some kind of, but in terms of growing up in New York, I felt like he was an important business figure. But then in more recent decades, he was much less important as a business figure. Right? He was the host of a celebrity reality TV show, right? Like you didn't really think about his businesses very much. But in the 80s, that's what was significant about him. Similarly, Bernie, in terms of like the left and a kind of anti-Reaganism, like I just thought, well, how is it that these people are coming back now? So I do think that it's almost like how one understands neoliberalism. So if you think of it as very recent, then Trump would represent like a kind of pre-neoliberal, a kind of anti-neoliberal, pre-neoliberal, like pre-globalization, idea. It's very confused on his part, super confused. I understand neoliberalism is going back to the 70s, but that's a different kind of way of characterizing it. So nonetheless, it does seem like, paradoxically, ironically, that post-neoliberalism took the form of a kind of pre-neoliberalism. So like Bernie being someone who stands for like the New Deal, the Great Society, the welfare state, a kind of pre-neoliberal, right, order. And then Trump in his own way, like make America great again. So when was that? It was the 90s, basically. Right? And so, but again, before the crisis of neoliberalism. So let's get back to when things worked. Whereas Bernie is a little bit deeper. He's thinking about the mistakes that were made over many decades rather than just more recently. Trump is much more about the mistakes of Bush and Obama. Right? Much more superficial in that respect. But the significance is that this is the appearance of the need for a post-neoliberal new consensus in the political order, and even at the level of like foreign policy, domestic policy, economic policy, military policy. Right. So that's the way I understand Trump. And that's why I wouldn't just say, okay, he's a Bonapartist figure in the sense of, the great man comes along to fix things, right? That kind of understanding. I don't. I think that, again, he's a much more peculiar kind of character who's like, can't we kind of undo the mistakes of the last kind of decade and a half, like Bush and Obama? Right. So that, much less inspiring view, but I also feel like the voters key into that. Like, I think, Make America Great Again doesn't mean like some ancient past. It means not that long ago, like before things got screwed up, before 9/11, before the Great Recession. All right. I mean, it seems to me, I don't know, is that too banal? Right? But it does seem like it's as simple as that, And so that's where I think the crisis of neoliberalism, the need for a new kind of politics, a new ideology, and maybe that would involve a slight shift in the electorate, new voting patterns, a shakeup of the parties and how they do things. That's really what Trump's significance is. Right? It's not a fundamental, like, again, my long history on the left, the Marxists are there to propagandize and claim that every disturbance in the capitalist system means the revolution is coming. I didn't think that. Right. But that's another question. That's maybe another aspect of the book, is the party question and what revolution even means in the Marxist view.
Well, what if we shift gears a bit and talk about the changes over at Sublation and your work with is it the campaign for
Campaign for a socialist party, yeah.
So can you tell us a bit about all that?
Yes. So speaking of which, in 2015, I had an idea. It was actually a New Year's resolution that I gave myself. It was several years into Platypus. It was getting towards the end of the Obama, second term. Before Bernie and Trump announced their campaigns, I assumed Hillary Clinton would be the nominee and the next president. I did. And I thought, okay, that's going to be an opportunity for starting something new on the left, trying to build a socialist movement and eventually a socialist party from the ground up. Then Bernie and Trump announced. And I saw all of the kind of millennial socialism get scooped up into support for Bernie. But also I saw, oh, actually, Trump could beat Hillary. I had a sense that Bernie would not be the nominee, that it would be Hillary nonetheless, but that Trump would likely beat Hillary. He could and likely would. And that threw a different kind of wrench into things. Because I saw that happening, even though I didn't necessarily desire it, because I realized that this would shift the left into a kind of anti-Trumpism, like kind of where the millennial left started off as anti-Bushism. Anti-war, anti-war on terror, anti-George W. Bush, which just gave us Obama in the end. So I did have this idea that there would be this window of opportunity. And especially, I thought after several years of working with the millennial left, almost 10 years working with the millennial left, starting in 2006, working with the millennial left, that, okay, maybe this could be something. Also back then, people that I had known on the left coming up, baby boom generation leftists, I realized, oh, they could mentor people in a new way. They could mentor people not in an ideological way, but in a practical way. because the 60s generation had done practical activism, organizing, that my generation had not really done, and that the millennials had also failed to do. And so I thought there was this window. Could we get one last contribution from the old generation, but in a very new way, in a different way? And hopefully they wouldn't be any more. It seemed like with the millennial left, early on at least, it seemed like they were willing to let go of their old ideological stuff and be much more pragmatic about things. So I thought there was this opportunity. But Bernie and Trump kind of threw things in another direction. And then, of course, a few years there of COVID interfering with the ability to organize on the ground, sort of delayed this. Now, so it's been on the back burner for me. So after some initial attempts prior to 2020, then it seemed like time to take it up again now, post-COVID. So my publisher, Doug Lane, caught wind of this, heard about this, and was excited by it. And I would say the occasion for it there is this year's election. Meaning, I think that there's a kind of a long process of disenchantment with the Democrats, disappointment at the Bernie campaign in 2016 and 2020, that people are finally coming around to the idea of, oh, yeah, we need to do something different. Because it's not just Doug Lane, also other people on the millennial left have approached me in the last year and have said basically, okay, Chris, what should we do? And as it turns out, I actually do have an answer, right? So now it's not in my book. It's not because it's not a theoretical answer. I mean, it's informed by a kind of view of history and a kind of a theory, gets to what I was just mentioning about like revolution. So my understanding of the history of Marxism is that the growth and development of the workers' movement for socialism itself produced the revolutionary crisis. So it's a very Rosa Luxemburg idea. It's a very old idea, but it's an obscure idea now. So it's not like, okay, the left or the socialists or the working class are over here and capitalism is over there, and then capitalism goes into crisis and then the socialists just take over, right? Almost like an extrinsic process. No, I see it quite the opposite, which is that I see the working class, when it gets organized, the class struggle, as really fundamentally shaping what capitalism is. That's the way Marx understood it in his time. It's the way the Marxists of Lenin's time understood it. And we've kind of forgotten that. That's a really key piece of the puzzle. And so for me, the time horizon for this would be that people could start now and build something up whose effects would be felt more long-term, meaning it would take decades to manifest into a real political opportunity for socialist revolution. So it wasn't about this immediate millennial moment. It wasn't about this immediate crisis of neoliberalism and the emergence of a kind of post-neoliberalism. It was much more with a long view and with a longer term process involved. And something that came up for the millennial generation. Kautskian patience is what it was called by the Communist Party of Great Britain's Mike McNair. When he's an ex-Trotskyist, he was looking at this history of Second International Marxism that Lenin came out of. And he reached back to Kautsky and the idea of patiently building the movement and the party. That it does take that. It does take a process of self-organization by the working class to get to a point where there could be a struggle for power. right? And that not to get ahead of oneself. So the problem with like Marxist sectarianism is that it gets ahead of itself. It treats the present as if it were 1917 or the 1930s, like, the kind of big crisis of communism and fascism, etc. It also misconstrues the 60s as a kind of repetition of 1917 or the 1930s, that it really wasn't. But, again, thinking about, well, what brought the world to the crisis in the early 20th century? Well, actually, decades of prior organizing of the working class with the aspiration of socialism, right? So not just like trade union organizing, not just that kind of civil social organizing ordinarily within capitalism of the working class and other people, but with the specific goal of socialism. So like, the difference between the Socialist Party of Eugene Debs and the populism, that movement that he came out of. The difference between Debs and William Jennings Bryan, for me, is crucial. So looking at the beginning of a process like that, like a kind of 1880s, 1890s process that we haven't seen because it's been cut short ideologically. I think the 20th century socialism, with the existence of the Soviet bloc, socialism and Marxism treated things as kind of ready-made, ready at hand. And I don't think that they really were. I mean, this is my Frankfurt School and Trotskyist background. I don't think the communist parties of the mid-20th century were like the older parties that the working class had built up in its class struggle. I think they were more progressive capitalist, technocratic, bureaucratic parties of managing the capitalist state. I don't think they were revolutionary parties. And I don't think that one has that instantaneously. So it's a very much older Marxist view that I have. And that's really what the Campaign for a Socialist Party would aspire to do. Also understanding that it won't be the same as in the past. So we have to figure it out, right? It's going to be a much more organic process. There isn't some script to follow. But there is a sense of it will take time and it will have to avoid certain things. And, the past is not a direct guide, but it has some things that we ought to keep in mind when embarking on such a process.
So,
right? Not ideologically Marxist in some theoretically hardcore way, but keeping the history of Marxism in mind.
Are you actually organizing in that vein,
Yeah.
like practically speaking? Are you
Yes.
through Platypus, or is that a
Separate from Platypus, because Platypus is like, a kind of student intellectual, theoretical, more academic kind of activity. So this is very different, extremely different. So what we have done in certain locales like Chicago and New York, and also overseas, so in the German-speaking world, in Germany and Austria, we have engaged in some like workers' rights, immigrants' rights, anti-police brutality, renters' rights, right? Organizing. Now, I should be careful. What I've aimed to do, again, the ambition's very modest at first. It's about taking people who want to be socialists and training them as organizers. And so it's not about like organizing a movement, it's more about training ourselves. So it's very preparatory. It's very preliminary. And it's seeing what's possible and really operating in a activist milieu that exists alongside the kind of progressive liberal like NGO type activities that take place in places like Chicago and New York. But also aware of the fact that there's a lot of invisible organizing of society, invisible to the left, but also invisible in the sense of not having a very strong public profile So what religious organizations do, what charitable organizations do, where they're not doing it for publicity. They're doing it for its own sake. Learning from that kind of activity, seeing what opportunities exist, and also being aware of the fact that while that does take place, there's actually a lot that's neglected. There's a sort of wide open field of self-organizing by working class people that can and should be done. Right? So it's exploratory, it's preparatory, it's training ourselves, it's learning the lay of the land. It's that kind of thing. Very modest and very practical, right? But we have done some. And I think it's a worthy thing, meaning I think that there are people who have a taste for that, an appetite for that, a desire to do that, right? For whom it's not about, again, these abstruse and esoteric ideas. So it's a different side of me. It's the organizer side of me. So Platypus is very different, it's very academic, it's very intellectual, but still took organizing, meaning you don't organize several hundred people throughout the world over the course of 20 years unless you're able to organize people, right? So it's just not possible to do that otherwise. So I know that I have some skills in that respect that I think can be put to use. And also some wisdom. I have I have my own background with some activism and some organizing. Limited, but enough. To help advise that. Because that's really my role. My role is as advising, because that's in the air. It's been in the air at different moments in the millennial left, base building, right? The need for kind of more civil social activity at the level of organizing. There have been impulses in that direction, mostly interrupted by the COVID crisis, but now coming around again. And I think this election this year, I think, is a moment where people just get disgusted with politics and are just like, yeah, I actually want to do something other than canvass for Democrats, right? And hope for the best. So, that's a very modest starting point, but it's a starting point.
Well, yeah, it was a weird, like, I guess the unions would call it a synchronicity. In your most recent Parrot Room with Doug, you were talking about doing some sort of gonzo journalism in the future or whatever. And I'd just been thinking about, I've had a kind of there's been drama in the Kansas City urban farming scene where there's this urban farm and they're doing pretty well, although they also have like pretty bad relations with their staff because there's no money to treat your staff well. So you just,
Yeah.
So you have these kind of rad lib kids coming in like, I'm going to change the world. And it's like, no, you're going to be basically a serf for a year.
You're going to be exploited by the NGOs pretty miserably. Yeah.
Right.
No,
Or the petite bourgeois business.
absolutely.
And those people mean well too intellectually.
Yeah.
And so it's that, and then they've grown too big, and now they're in a historically black neighborhood, and then they're mad about how, this is my read on the situation, these people simultaneously white trash, and then they're servicing wealthy white people, and that's probably infuriating. And so they've gotten themselves in trouble with the codes, and now the cities come in and they're making dubious claims that they're not up to code. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. And then from the outside, you're trying to see like, well, what's true? And then there's like just the shittiest journalism out there about it. Like the neighbor says X, they say Y, the city says Z. All right, you won't hear anything for 4 months. And it's just struck me how like there's no it having done all of this thinking and over the years engaging with lots of people, including you and Doug, it's like nobody can pull their head out of their asses to realize this is like a deep crisis of bourgeois society. And
right. And so it does require some kind of a coherent vision and aspiration. It does. To make sense of, and to make like meaningful mistakes that you could learn from. So the journalism idea is, of course, the people who have been approaching me, coming out of the woodwork, asking me what should be done, are intellectuals or more intellectually minded activists. And so I thought, well, one thing that they could do to motivate their engagement with on the ground organizing is learn about it by trying to write about it. So journalism, right? That it's a kind of ready way of matching people's existing skill sets with what they are aspiring to become.
Right.
Right. And also because, I know from my academic teaching, writing, it disciplines your thinking. It makes you reflect. I mean, hopefully, right? If it's not just gossipy, right? But if it's really about, okay, and what does this tell us about social reality? What's going on here, right? What questions does it raise about what's possible in these situations and the larger context that they exist in? So I think it's a good way of setting the intellectuals to task, disciplining their activity, focusing their minds, rather than just the sort of weird, like, ontological debates about like philosophy and, this kind of thing. It's like, oh, well, what about the lack? Yeah, no, I don't know. I guess I just want things to be more real, you know? I mean, so that makes me sound like a Philistine. I'm anything but I also know, maybe because of my art background, I kind of feel like I know what's better ruminated on artistically and poetically, and the difference between that and politics, and trying to deal with social reality. So like I said, I have, you know, I'm happy thinking abstractly and thinking theoretically, but I also have a practically oriented side, right? And there's a real need there. We can't take that for granted.
I totally agree with that. I think intellectuals generally should reorient. Not entirely, you always have to have that, side in theory, but theory's no good if it's not put into use in the real world and adapted to the real world. So, yeah, thank you for doing that work. I mean, that's exciting. It's a change in what you're doing, and for Sublation Press, it's cool to see. People should take a look at the website if they haven't. There's everything's there, not just the books, but lots of different ways to engage, as well as what you were just talking about, the program.
Mhm.
So, but we probably kept you over long. But is there anything else you wanted to say before we head out for this time?
No, this was great. Yes, I mean, I have produced this 2-volume work, these 2 books with Sublation Press, The Death of the Millennial Left and Marxism and Politics. I describe it as 1,000 pages and 100 articles. The first book is about 250 pages. The second book is about 750 pages. And there's just a lot there, hopefully in bite-sized form, and therefore digestible in that way, rather than a massive treatise. And so I do encourage people to read it. I think that there's something to learn. I think we're in a taking stock moment about recent history and where we are now. And so, I decided to collect my writings and publish them now because I did think it was an appropriate moment for it. And also because I was looking to maybe do different kind of writing than I had done in the last 20 years. and free myself up to try other things. And so, yeah, I would say that I'm glad that you guys found it fruitful and engaging, and I hope that others do too.
Absolutely. We will put a link to the website as well as the book in the notes, and people should take a look at it. It's in digestible chunks too, so you can, read one in like 20 minutes, go do something else, come back, read another one. So it's not the 750.
Dip in and out.
Yeah, it's kind of like misleading. It might be kind of scary, but it's the kind of book that you can dip into and out of. Yes, and over the course of a year, like, honestly, I mean, for a lot of people, because they're busy, but over the course of the year, they would have a hell of an education. So,
Thank you.
yeah, we really appreciate the work that you've done, and hope you will come back again, of course.
Yes, I'll look forward to it.